A 90-pound Belgian Malinois with a kill record that made veteran handlers flinch was airborne, jaws wide, locked onto a target that hadn't moved an inch. The men watching from behind the chain link expected screaming. What they got instead was silence, and the slow, sick realization that they'd just handed a loaded weapon back to the one person who'd built it. The base sat outside Petawawa, Ontario, the kind of cold that gets into the seams of your jacket and stays there even in late spring. CFB Petawawa's K9 unit trained on a stretch of gravel and scrub pine that had chewed up more handlers than anyone cared to admit, and on this particular morning the air smelled like wet earth and adrenaline. Master Warrant Officer Tobias Kane stood with his arms crossed at the edge of the training pen, watching a German shepherd named Ghost throw himself against a tether with enough force to rattle the chain link. Ghost wasn't supposed to be like this. 6 months ago, he'd been the unit's pride, a dual-purpose patrol and detection dog with a file full of commendations. Then his handler, Corporal Liam Ferreira, had taken a round outside Kandahar, 2 tours back that never quite left him. Not the body, the mind. And 3 weeks ago, Ferreira had put in for medical release and walked off the base without so much as a goodbye to the dog he'd run with for 4 years. Since then, Ghost had bitten 2 handlers, torn the sleeve off a third, and put 1 trainee in the infirmary with a dislocated shoulder. The official recommendation sitting on Major Eleanor Vance's desk used the word unsalvageable. Into the middle of this walked a woman nobody recognized. She was maybe 5'5", dressed plainly in civilian outdoor gear, a grey fleece and worn hiking boots that had clearly logged miles that weren't recreational. She carried a battered field notebook under one arm and nothing else. No weapon, no leash, no obvious authority. Her hair was dark, cropped short and practical, and she walked the perimeter of the training yard the way someone reads a room before they speak in it. Slow, deliberate, missing nothing. "That's her," muttered Sergeant Holt Brennan, a broad-shouldered handler with a jaw that always looked clenched. The contractor Vance called in. "Behaviourist or something." "She's going to last about 4 minutes," said Corporal Danny Oakfor, not bothering to lower his voice. The woman's name, according to the clipboard Major Vance carried out to meet her, was Dr. Margot Alessi. She'd flown in from a working dog rehabilitation program out west, and the paperwork said she specialized in operational canines with what the file delicately called attachment trauma. Vance, a tall woman in her late 40s with silver threading through dark hair and 22 years of service, stitched into the set of her shoulders, shook Alessi's hand with the careful neutrality of someone who'd already decided this was a long shot. "He's not aggressive in the textbook sense," Vance said, walking her toward the pen. "He's grieving, but grief with 80 pounds of jaw pressure behind it still puts people in hospital." Alessi didn't answer right away. She'd stopped at the fence, watching Ghost pace the length of his tether, ears pinned, tail rigid. There was something in her face that wasn't quite professional distance. It looked, if anyone had been close enough to catch it, almost like recognition. "How long has he been refusing handlers?" she asked. 3 weeks. Since Ferreira left." Vance's jaw tightened slightly on the name. "We've tried 4 different handlers. He took the last one's sleeve clean off, and the recommendation is destruction. The recommendation is that this dog is no longer fit for service and represents a liability we can't manage." Vance said it like a line she'd practiced, like she didn't entirely believe it herself. "I have until Friday to file the paperwork. I called your program because I was told you do what nobody else will try. I'd like to see that before I sign anything." Brennan, who'd drifted close enough to listen, didn't bother hiding his skepticism. "With respect, ma'am, she's not even military. What exactly is she going to do that 4 trained handlers couldn't?" "I'm going to introduce myself," Alessi said, not turning around. That got a laugh out of Okofor, short and disbelieving. "Lady, that dog put Petty Officer Drummond in a sling on Tuesday. He doesn't want introductions." Alessi finally looked at him, and there was nothing unkind in her expression, just a kind of patient certainty that made the laugh die a little faster than it had started. "He's not refusing people," she said. "He's refusing substitutes. There's a difference, and it's the difference that's going to get somebody killed if nobody bothers to learn it." She set her notebook down on the fence post and asked for the gate. Vance hesitated. Protocol said no unaccompanied civilian entered an active K9 enclosure with a dog flagged for aggression, full stop. But something about the request, the lack of bravado in it, the absence of the swagger she'd have expected from someone trying to prove a point, made her reach for the latch instead of refusing outright. "You go in," Vance said quietly, "and if he comes for you, my people pull him off. That's the deal. Understood?" Brennan stepped forward instinctively, hand half raised like he meant to physically stop her, and Vance held up a hand to still him. The gate creaked open, Alessi stepped through, and for the first time in 3 weeks, Ghost stopped pacing. He went rigid at the end of the tether, every muscle drawn tight, head low, a growl building somewhere under his ribs, the men along the fence tensed in unison, hands drifting toward breaksticks they all knew, deep down. Wouldn't matter much if this went wrong. Alessi didn't reach for the dog. She didn't speak. She crouched, slowly, lowering herself to something closer to his eye level, and waited. 30 seconds passed, then a full minute. Ghost's growl didn't stop, but it changed pitch, something less certain bleeding into it. His ears, pinned flat since the moment Ferreira had walked off the base, twitched once. Alessi said something then, quiet enough that nobody at the fence caught the words. Whatever it wasn't English in the way Brennan expected. Softer syllables, almost musical, the kind of private language people develop with animals they've known since infancy. Ghost's growl cut off mid-breath. He took one step forward, stiff-legged, suspicious, and pressed his nose against Alessi's outstretched palm. The yard went completely silent. Then his tail, which hadn't moved in 3 weeks except to lash in warning, gave one tentative wag. "That's not possible," Brennan said under his breath. It was Major Vance who finally broke the silence at the fence, her voice carrying an edge none of them had heard from her before. "Dr. Alessi, I think you'd better explain who you actually are before this goes any further." Alessi rose slowly, one hand still resting on the dog's head, and turned to face the row of stunned faces along the chain link. "I run a breeding and rehabilitation program for working dogs," she said. "Most of what I do is paperwork and follow-up visits, but 4 years ago I whelped a litter outside Yellowknife for a contractor supplying dual-purpose dogs to the forces. There were 6 pups. One of them got placed with a young corporal who was about to deploy for the first time." She looked down at Ghost, who'd pressed his whole weight against her leg like he meant to disappear into her. "His registered name was Sirius. I imagine you know him as something else." Nobody spoke. Okafor's jaw had gone slack. Brennan looked like he'd been hit with something heavier than words. "You bred him," Vance said slowly. "I bred him. I raised him for the first 14 weeks of his life before he ever met Corporal Ferreira." Alessi's voice didn't waver, but something underneath it did. "I track every dog I place. When I heard Ferreira had been released and the dog was flagged for destruction, I asked to be the one who came out." "Why didn't you say that the second you walked in?" Brennan asked, and it wasn't hostile anymore, just baffled. "Because if I'd told you who I was, you'd have assumed it was sentiment doing the work in there, not skill." Alessi finally let herself smile, faint and tired. "It wasn't sentiment. He let me in because I know exactly how he was built, what he was bred for, and what breaks an animal like this when the one constant in his world disappears without a word. Sentiment doesn't get a dog like Ghost to stand down. Understanding does." Vance exhaled slowly, some of the rigidity going out of her shoulders. "Major Colette." She stopped herself, shook her head slightly, a habit from another posting. "He's still flagged. Sentiment or science. I still need to know he's operationally sound before Friday. Then test him," Alessi said. "Properly, not against a sleeve in a yard, against something that actually matters." That was Hassa. 2 days later, Half of CFB Petawawa's K9 unit found itself crowded onto the observation catwalk of the close-quarters training facility. Watching a live fire simulation, nobody had expected to run this particular working dog through, with this particular handler standing at the gate. The shoot house was a converted warehouse rigged with collapsible walls, role players in padded gear, and enough variables to make even seasoned operators sweat. Captain Idris Whitfield, who oversaw the facility and had heard the whole story secondhand with no small amount of doubt, stood at the controls with his arms folded. "You understand," Whitfield said to Vance, loud enough for the room, "that if this goes sideways, it's not just the dog's career that's over. I understand exactly what's at stake, Captain." Vance didn't look away from the monitor. "Run it." Alessi crouched beside Ghost at the entry point, her hand resting flat against his chest, feeling the steady drum of his heartbeat. "Last time you were in a building like this," she murmured, low enough that only the dog could hear, "you had somebody else's voice in your ear. Tonight you've got mine. That's the only thing that's different. Everything you know how to do, you still know how to do." The door opened. Ghost moved. He cleared the first room in a controlled sweep, low and fast, exactly the way he'd been trained before grief had ever entered the picture. Alessi moved behind him, weapon light tracking the dark corners, calling soft directional commands that Ghost answered before she'd fully finished saying them. On the catwalk, Brennan's mouth had fallen open. Okafor had stopped breathing somewhere around the second doorway. It was in the third room, a mock bedroom rigged for a hostage scenario, that the simulation threw its hardest variable. A role player burst from a closet positioned directly behind Alessi's blind spot, padded weapon raised, close enough that in a real engagement she'd have been dead before she ever registered the threat. Ghost didn't bark. He didn't hesitate. He launched. 90 pounds of dog hit the role player square in the chest, with enough force to drive him backward into the drywall, hard enough to crack it. On the catwalk, someone shouted to kill the lights, kill the sim. Somebody's about to get hurt. Whitfield's hand hovered over the emergency stop. "Wait," Vance said sharply, eyes locked on the monitor. "Watch his mouth." Ghost wasn't tearing at the role player's throat. He had the man's padded forearm clamped in a precise, controlled bite, weight pinned across his chest, holding the simulated weapon completely immobilized, while the role player struggled uselessly beneath him. It was textbook restraint, the exact discipline Ghost had been bred and trained for, executed with a precision none of them had seen out of him in months. Alessi spun at the sound, weapon up, assessed the threat in half a second, and lowered her carbine. She gave a single low command. Ghost released instantly, backed off 2 paces, and sat, eyes locked on the downed role player, every line of his body coiled and ready but obedient. "Target neutralized," Alessi said into the radio, her voice perfectly level. "Structure clear, ending exercise." The overhead lights flooded the warehouse. The role player, still catching his breath on the floor, started laughing in the particular way people laugh after they've genuinely been afraid. "Good God," he said. "Good dog. Good Jesus. Good dog." Up on the catwalk, nobody said anything for a long moment. Vance came down the metal stairs first, her boots ringing against each step, and crossed the floor to where Alessi stood with one hand resting on Ghost's head, the dog leaning his full weight into her leg, tail moving in slow, easy sweeps now instead of rigid warning. "I've run this unit for 6 years, Vance said. I've watched a lot of good handlers move through this house. I have never seen a team move like that." She looked down at the dog, who met her gaze without flinching, without a trace of the wild-eyed aggression that had defined him for 3 weeks. "Doctor, I owe you an apology, and I owe him one too. I was 12 hours from signing a euthanization order on an animal that wasn't broken. He was waiting." "He wasn't waiting for me specifically," Alessi said quietly. "He was waiting for someone who understood that the silence after Corporal Ferreira left wasn't him being dangerous. It was him being abandoned, and nobody around him had a word for that except aggression. Brennan had come down off the catwalk too, and he stood a few feet back, the swagger that had carried him through the week now nowhere in evidence. "Doc," he said, and the word came out rougher than he meant it to. "I laughed at you Tuesday. Told you you'd last 4 minutes." He extended a hand, the same hand that had hovered near a breakstick 3 days earlier. "I was wrong, and I'd like to say that to your face instead of behind your back." Alessi shook it. Most people would have made the same call. He gave you every reason to. Vance crouched, something she rarely did in front of her unit, and let Ghost sniff the back of her hand before resting it lightly against his shoulder. "What happens now? Operationally, I mean. Can he go back to active rotation? He needs a handler who's prepared to relearn him from the ground up, not retrain him like he's starting from zero. He's not starting from zero. He's starting from grief, and that's a different animal entirely, pun very much intended." Alessi allowed herself a small, tired smile. "If you've got someone on this base patient enough to do that properly, he'll be better than he ever was. Dogs like this don't lose what they know. They just need someone to prove the world's still safe enough to use it." Whitfield, still standing by the now useless emergency stop button, shook his head slowly. 20 years in this job, he said, mostly to himself. "I thought I'd seen every version of what a working dog could do. Tonight I saw a new one." The yard outside the shoot house had gone quiet and cold under a sky just beginning to clear, the kind of stillness that follows something that everyone present knows they'll be talking about for years. Okafor came down last, hands in his pockets, looking at Ghost with an expression that had shifted from disbelief to something closer to respect. "For what it's worth," he said, "Drummond's gonna want to hear all this. He took it personal, getting bit. Tell him it was never personal," Alessi said. Ghost didn't know him from anyone else who wasn't Ferreira. That's the whole tragedy of it. He wasn't choosing not to trust people. He just hadn't been given a reason yet. Vance straightened, looking out over the dim training yard as if seeing it differently than she had an hour ago. "I'll need a full report for the file, but as far as I'm concerned, the recommendation for destruction is withdrawn effective tonight." She paused, glancing back at Alessi. "There's a question I haven't asked you yet, and I think I'm owed the answer. If he's bonded that deeply to you, to the person who raised him before he ever belonged to anyone else, how is it you got him to run a flawless operation with a stranger's commands layered over yours? You didn't grow up giving him tactical signals." Alessi looked down at Ghost, scratching slowly behind one scarred ear, and for the first time that night her composure cracked just slightly, something warmer and more private showing through. "Because I didn't try to be Corporal Ferreira," she said. "I never could be, and I wouldn't have wanted to be. I just reminded him who he was before any of this. Before deployments, before grief, before a handler that loved him so much that losing him nearly broke them both. Tonight he wasn't backing up a stranger. He was finishing something with the person who started him in the first place." Vance nodded slowly, and for once there was nothing left in her expression but quiet respect. "Welcome to Petawawa, Dr. Alessi. I have a feeling you and that dog are going to be here a while." Ghost let out a long breath against Alessi's leg, the tension that had lived in his body for 3 solid weeks finally easing out of him in the cold night air. He wasn't looking at the men around him as threats anymore. He was looking at them, ears soft, tail still, like he was finally, fully home. He hadn't been broken. He'd just been waiting for someone to remember who he was before everything fell apart. And that, more than any sleeve drill or obedience score, was the only proof anyone in that yard would ever need.